Just a quick reminder before we get into the lesson to download the hands-on lab exercises that accompany this complete CCNA course. I'll include the link in the description. Also remember to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you don't miss any of the lessons in the course. Okay, let's get into it. In this lecture, you'll learn about configuring basic security on your Cisco routers and switches by configuring passwords at the line level. When you first get a router or switch from the factory, you take it out of the box, you can connect it with a console cable and you can immediately start configuring it. There's no password required. When you deploy that router or switch into your production environment, you want to make sure that it's only authorized administrators that can get on there. You don't want anybody else trying to make any changes. So we're going to configure security to ensure that. First up, a quick reminder of the iOS command hierarchy. By default, when you first connect to a router or switch, you'll be at user exec mode. And this is a very limited level. There's very few commands that you run here. You can tell you're at user exec mode because the command prompt will show the host name of the router or switch and then a greater than symbol. So to really be able to do much on the router or switch, you need to escalate your privilege level. You do that with the enable command, and that will get you into privileged exec mode. That's where you can run all of the show commands and all of the debug commands. When you do enter the enable command, you'll see the command prompt changes to show the host name and then a hash. So you can view information about the router there. To make any changes, you need to get into global configuration mode. The command for that is configure terminal or config T, and you'll see that the prompt changes to include config in brackets. And then when you configure a particular thing on the router or switch, like a routing protocol or an interface, you go to that level and then the prompt will change again. For example, the host name and then config-if for configure interface if you're at the interface configuration level. Okay, so basic line level security. Minimal password security can be configured through the use of static, locally defined passwords at 3 different levels. And we'll get to the more advanced ways that we can do security later on in this section. So for just the basic minimal level of security, you can use local, meaning it's configured on the router or switch itself, and static passwords, they don't generally change. The 3 levels that you can do this at, the first one is at the console line. So this affects you if you're accessing user exec mode when connecting via a console cable. Next one is virtual terminal VTY line. This affects you if you're accessing the device when you're connecting remotely via Telnet or SSH secure shell. And finally, we can set a password at the privileged exec mode. We do this by setting a password on going to enter the enable command. Those 3 levels can be used independently or in combination with each other, and they can use the same or different passwords. So, for example, I could just put a password on the VTY line if I wanted to, or I could put passwords on there and on the console line and on privilege exec mode as well. If you just put a password on your virtual terminal VTY lines, you would be required to enter a password if you were using Telnet or SSH to access the device, but if you were connected up with a console cable, you wouldn't require a password. And also, if you just did it there, then when you went to the enable mode, you wouldn't be required to enter an additional password for enable mode. If we did enter passwords, say, at all 3 levels, I could use password 1 on the console, password 2 on VTY, and password 3 for the enable prompt, or I could use password 1 on all 3 of them. So you can use the same or you can use different passwords. So first one was configuring a password on the console line. If you do this, then whenever you connect with a console cable, you're going to need to enter that password to actually get access to the command line. With a console connection, so when you're connected up over a console port, only one person can be connected over the console at a time. So when you configure this, the line number is always going to be 0 because there's only one line number available. So for our config would be a global configuration, line console 0, and then password, say whatever password you want to be required, and then you put in the login command. You have to put in that login command as well. It's mandatory. When you say login, that means that whenever somebody connects up over the console and they want to get access to the command line, they have to enter the password that is configured under the console line. So we enter that config, then we do hook up to the device with a console cable, and then when we look at that on our administrator workstation, when we do the connection, we'll see a prompt. So we see that in the example, it's R1 we're on here. Console line 0 is now available. Press return to get started. We hit return, and it will then prompt us for a password. So it says user access verification password, and we enter the password in there that we configured under the line. If we enter the wrong password, it will prompt us for the password again. If we enter the correct password, then we will get into the device at the user exec mode. And you can see that down at the bottom there. We're at R1, greater than symbol, we're at user exec mode. So that was configuring a password on the console line. If you just configure a password on the console line, but you don't configure a password anywhere else, in the other methods, people won't be prompted for a password. So we want to enable a password for sure when people are connecting remotely over Telnet or SSH. We'll talk about Telnet first in this lecture. I'll show you how to enable SSH in a later lecture. So an administrator can use Telnet to connect to the command line of a router or switch remotely over an IP connection. But your router or switch does not accept incoming sessions by default for Telnet. You need to set this up. So what you need to do is you need to configure an IP address, and you need to enable Telnet access under the VTY line. VTY line is virtual terminal, and that is used for incoming Telnet and SSH connections. So first thing that we needed to do there was to configure an IP address. You already know how to configure an IP address on your router. We covered it on the switch before as well, but I'll just give you a quick reminder here. So a layer 2 switch is not IP routing aware. It's a layer 2 device. It does, however, support a single IP address for management so that you'll be able to Telnet or SSH into it. A default gateway will also need to be configured if you want it to have connectivity to other IP subnets. So our configuration for this is we do it under the SVI, the switched virtual interface. That's interface VLAN 1, or you could use a different VLAN number if you want. Give it an IP address, then say no shutdown and exit, and then to configure the default gateway router it's going to use, IP default gateway and the IP address of the router. So that gets an IP address on your switch so that you're going to be able to Telnet to it. If it's a layer 2 switch, if you try to add a second IP address, it's going to overwrite the first one. You're only ever allowed to have one IP address on there. Okay, so basic Telnet security. With our console line, as you saw earlier, only one person can connect over that at a time, but for Telnet and SSH, you can have multiple administrators working on the device at the same time. But there's a limited number of lines that are available depending on the device. Usually it's 16. Those lines are allocated on a first-come, first-served basis. So if all 16 lines are already in use and then another administrator tries to Telnet onto the box, they're going to be rejected. So our configuration here is line VTY 0 and then 15. That's configuring all of our terminal lines. Then we say password, we're using FLACKBOX'S here, and login. Login again means use the password that is configured under the line. You will sometimes see a configuration here saying line VTY 0 and then 4. If you do that, you've only got 5 lines available. So it's better to enable all of the different lines. Once we have configured that, if I'm on my administrator workstation and I go to Telnet to the router. So the way I would do that would be Telnet 10.0.0.1, the IP address. It will then prompt me for a password, and I have to enter the correct password there. When I do that, I'll get into the user exec mode, as you see here. Okay, so that was console and Telnet passwords. Another thing to talk about here is the exec timeout. By default, you will be logged out if you don't enter any commands on the router or switch for 10 minutes. The reason this is maybe you were working on the device at your desk, and then you go away to make a cup of coffee, and then you get talking to somebody, and when that happens, you don't want to leave yourself logged in at your desk in case somebody is walking past, and then they can jump on and see the configuration on that router. So it's a security feature that you'll be automatically logged out after 10 minutes of inactivity by default, but you can change that to a different value if you want. So you could set it to log you out quicker, or you could set it to log you out after a longer period. If you say no exec timeout or exec timeout 0, that disables the exec timeout, which means you can stay logged in indefinitely. The commands to configure this, again, it's configured at the line level, so you can do it separately for console and for Telnet. For the console, we've got line console 0, exec timeout 15, which means we'll be logged out after 15 minutes of inactivity. And then we say line VTY 015 for our Telnet lines, exec timeout 5 space 30. If you put in two numbers here, the first one is a value in minutes, the second one is a value in seconds. So there we would be logged out after 5 minutes and 30 seconds of inactivity. Another good reason that it's good to have the exec timeout, if we go back a couple of slides, was when we were talking about if all the lines are in use, then nobody else is going to be able to get in. So let's say that you had configured your 15 lines, but the administrators have not been clearing their sessions properly. Then if all 15 are in use and you've disabled the exec timeout, then nobody's going to be able to telnet into that router. You would have to go and connect with a console connection to clear those sessions. So it's a really good idea to have that exec timeout configured on there. Don't disable it, both for security reasons and to make sure that users, administrators, will be timed out if they did not clear their sessions cleanly. Okay, moving on. Next thing, we can secure our virtual terminal lines with access lists to get an additional level of security. So that can be used to limit Telnet and SSH access so that only your administrator workstations are going to be able to log in. To do this, we configure a standard ACL. So I've got access list 1, permit host 10.0.0.10. 10.0.0.10 is my administrator workstation in this example. It doesn't have to be an individual host. We could specify an entire subnet here if you've got multiple administrators all with a source IP address in the same subnet. And then to apply it to the terminal lines, we say line VTY 015. We've got our login password and we've got our login command and our password command as usual. And then we say access class 1 in to apply that access list. Now what happens is for an administrator to be able to log in, we need to enter that password that we configured on the line, and they need to be coming in from an approved IP address as well. So if I try to telnet into this device now, and I'm not using IP address 10.0.0.10, I'm coming from a different location, the error message I'll see is connection refused by remote host. While we were talking about that, so I said earlier that for Telnet access, you need to configure an IP address and you need to configure Telnet access under the line as well. If you do not specify a login under your VTY lines, then nobody is going to be able to Telnet to that device. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to get the complete course ad-free right now, then you can enroll in my CCNA Gold Bootcamp by clicking the link above my head or in the description. It also includes full study notes, quizzes, and 150 pages of additional troubleshooting labs you can't find anywhere else.